Welcome to Homegrown Tales, a live storytelling event held at Brews, 2 Piney Spring in Eureka Springs. The following was recorded October 4th, 2023 at Brews. And now here's Zeek Taylor to introduce the program.
I'd like to welcome you to Homegrown Tales. I'm thrilled to be joined on stage this evening by Crescent Dragonwagon and John Rankine. Not only are they dear friends, they are both master storytellers. My co-producer Sandra Spots is out of town and cannot join us tonight, but she'll be here for the next show in December. And I know you've enjoyed the music of Mick Bird. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Mick. Mick is a popular musician from the Ozarks, and he is a member of the Missouri Blues Society and the Tennessee Songwriters Association International. Mick has performed at the legendary Bluebird Cafe in Nashville for over 20 years. An award from Billboard magazine kicked off his music career in 1994. 11 recording later, Mick brings fans an amazing array of original roots rock, country, and his signature Ozark blues. Whether in his travels across Missouri, United States, or Ireland, people everywhere find common ground in Mick's music. Let's hear from Mick. Great music. And this is where Sandra usually introduces me, so I'll just tell you. I'm Zeek Taylor, and I'm going to read the first story tonight. It's called Wet and Wild. In the early 70s, while a student at the Memphis College of Art, I attended a lecture by Jimmy Driftwood. He was a famed folk singer and folk historian who had written thousands of songs. He was most famous for his songs The Battle of New Orleans and Tennessee Stud. He lived in Timbo, Arkansas, near Mountain View. Mountain View hosted a yearly festival each April. During his lectures, Mr. Driftwood invited college students to attend the festival. My partner Dick, 2 fellow art students, Linda and David, and I thought it would be fun to attend the folk festival. We decided that the most cost-effective way to make the trip was to camp out. Dick had an Army surplus canvas tent that was large enough to accommodate the 4 of us. Linda, a fun-loving photography student, and David, a painting major who was somewhat of a diva, had never camped, and they were excited about experiencing a new adventure. I also planned to take my toy poodle Chelsea with us on the trip. We prepared picnic food to avoid the expense of eating out. Dick owned a Coleman camping stove that we could use for cooking. The night before our trip, we loaded everything except for the food into my pink 1959 Chevrolet Impala. The car was loaned to me by my father, and it was the same car in which I had learned to drive many years earlier. The car was huge, and my father liked to say that it was as long as a whore's dream, whatever that means. The next morning when we were to leave Memphis for Mountain View, I could not find the car keys. Alas, the trip was off. Disappointed, I started unpacking. I had boiled a dozen eggs that I had wrapped in aluminum foil. When I unwrapped them, my keys were with the eggs. The trip was on once again. 3 hours later, we were in the Ozark town of Mountain View. It was like stepping back in time. On the quaint square, there was music everywhere. There were fiddlers, banjo players, singers, and cloggers. Authentic hill music filled the air. Along with hundreds of folk devotees, we spent a wonderful afternoon and evening enjoying the festival. Earlier that day, we had pitched our tent in a camping area at Selmore Creek, 5 miles from town. We were joined by dozens of other campers. During the night while we were sleeping, the skies opened and heavy rains came. The small meandering creek in the park became a roaring river. The campground quickly flooded. Cars and tents were washed down the swollen creek. Fortunately, no lives were lost. We had pitched our tent a little ways from the creek. Although we were spared the worst effects of the flood, we did get some water inside of our tent. The weather front that brought us the massive rains that April also ushered in unseasonably cold temperatures. The temps fell into the upper 30s. A brisk breeze created an even lower wind chill temperature. We abandoned the tent and took refuge in the car. After the rain stopped and daylight came, we loaded up our soggy belongings and moved into town. We found a spot in downtown Mountain View behind a laundromat that was filled with folks washing their wet and muddy clothes. The dryers were constantly in motion. We pitched our tent near the dryer vents at the rear of the building. Hot air blew in through the tent's front door, and we were toasty warm. We celebrated our survival with a breakfast of hot oatmeal. Every now and then we ventured into the laundromat to watch naked people barely covered by towels wash and dry their clothes. We stayed in Mountain View for the remainder of the festival, and through it all, the music never stopped. I doubt if David and Linda ever went camping again. The next reader tonight is going to be my friend Crescent Dragonwagon. Crescent Dragonwagon is the author of more than 55 published books in genres including children's books, memoir, fiction, and culinary writing. New Yorker by birth, she now lives in Fayetteville, Arkansas, but spent 33 years in Eureka Springs. There she co-founded Dairy Hollow House, a country inn and restaurant, which she and her late husband, Ned Shank, transitioned into a non-profit writers' colony at Dairy Hollow in 1998. It's still going strong. She developed fearless writing, an approach she has taught hundreds of students worldwide, many of whom has gone on to publish successfully. She will next lead a Fearless this coming December in Italy. The first story she's going to read tonight, A Tale of Two Tigers, touches on another piece of her life's work. She is literary executor for her mother, Charlotte Zolto, a children's book writer. Both this story and the one she will read later pertain to Halloween, as well to the persistent emotions, difficult and sweet, which haunt all of us as human beings. Here's my friend Crescent.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to October and Halloween in Eureka Springs. This is a tale of one of the tigers, and at the end I will tell you the tale of the second tiger, and perhaps even a third tiger. And this book was written by Charlotte Zoltow, my late mother. There was once a little boy named Tomas. He was very nice, but when he and his family moved to a new house on a new street, he took it into his head that the new people might not like him. So he never left his front stoop. "Why don't you play with that little girl Marie?" his mama asked him. "Maybe she wouldn't like me," Tomas said. "Of course she'd like you," his mama said. "Why wouldn't she? ¿Por qué no?" But Tomas didn't answer. "Why don't you visit the lady with the black cat down the street?" his mama asked. "They might not like me," Tomas said. "Of course they'd like you. Why shouldn't they like you? ¿Por qué no?" said his mama. But Tomas didn't go. "That tall boy named Gerald looks lonely," his mama said. "I don't think he'd like me," Tomas said. "Of course he'd like you," said Tomas's mama. "Why shouldn't he like you? ¿Por qué no? Everyone likes you." But Tomas wouldn't leave his step. He sat there and watched as Marie played hopscotch. He sat there and watched the old woman's cat as it prowled through the grass and shrubs. He sat there and watched when Gerald walked past the house, and he thought about how very tall Gerald was. "Oh, Tomas," said his mama, "everyone will like you. Why don't you go play?" But Tomas shook his head and just sat on the steps, watching. The lady in the house across the street was always out in her yard, watering the plants, raking the leaves, sweeping the walk, picking her flowers, and all the while, Tomas sat and watched. He watched the old man come up the street with his big black poodle 3 times a day. The poodle always looked over its shoulder at Tomas, and its tail stood up like a small palm tree and wagged from side to side. But Tomas just sat and watched them pass. He watched the sparrows and the grackles and the blue jays in the trees. He watched the black cat look up at the sparrows and grackles and blue jays, but he never went off the stoop to play. On Halloween, his mama came home with a tiger costume for him. "Try this on," she said. Tomas put on the orange and black striped suit with its quilted tail and the mask with its long whiskers. "How do I look?" he asked his mama. "Exactly like a tigra," she said. Tomas looked in the mirror. His mama was right. "No one will know who I am when I go trick-or-treating," he said. There was a large orange moon in the sky, and it was already getting dark when Tomas went out. The branches of the trees hardly even showed, except where they laced across the moon. He crossed the street to the house of the lady who was always outside. The chrysanthemums were still blooming in front of her house. "Trick or treat," Tomas called when she came to the door. "Well, hello," the lady said. She dropped a package of orange candies into his bag. "Happy Halloween." "Thank you," answered the tiger. "You're welcome, Tomas," the lady said, closing the door. Under his mask, Tomas flushed. "That's funny," he said. "She called the tiger Tomas." At the next house, he rang the bell. "Trick or treat." Marie's mother opened the door. She had candied apples for a treat. "Oh, thank you," the tiger said, for he particularly liked candied apples. "You're welcome," said Marie's mother. "Marie is a witch tonight. Maybe you'll pass her. But anyway, come play hopscotch here tomorrow, Tomas." "Thank you," Tomas said again. But when the door closed, he reached up to feel his mask. It was still on, covering his face. "That's funny," he thought. "She knew who I was, too." He passed a tall ghost going up to the house as he left. He couldn't see the ghost's face, but there was something very familiar about this figure. "Hi, Tomas," said the ghost. "Want to play horseshoes tomorrow? Got a new set?" "Sure," said Tomas. The ghost was Gerald. Tomas could tell by the height. He went to the old man's house. The black poodle threw back his head and barked wildly when he saw the tiger at the door, but when he sniffed at the tiger's feet and sniffed at the tiger's quilted tail, he suddenly put up his own palm tree tail and wagged it hard. "Trick or treat," the tiger said. The old man had made big pumpkin cookies. "Fresh baked, Tomas," he said, winking as he dropped one in the bag. "Best thing for tigers." And winked again. He called the tiger Tomas too, thought Tomas. Now he rang the bell of the old lady with the black cat. "Trick or treat," he called. Come in," the little old woman said. The black cat looked curiously at the tiger, and the tiger reached out to stroke the cat's black fur. "He loves that," the little old lady laughed. "Come play with him again, Tomas. He gets lonely." "So do I," said Tomas. She knew too, he thought, as he turned towards home. The orange moon was a little higher in the sky. The sky was a little blacker than before. He couldn't see any of the branches in front of it now. A group of ghosts and goblins was coming down the steps of the lady across the street, and a solitary but familiar-looking witch with her broom under her arm passed him. He looked at her curiously as he walked slowly toward the steps of his house. It was Marie who said, "Hi, Tomas." Tomas walked upstairs to his house, to his room. He looked in the mirror at the tiger, at the tigre. The tigre in the mirror looked back at him, whiskers and all. "Have a good time?" asked his mama. "How did they know who I was?" Tomas said. "Did they?" said his mother. "Yes," Tomas said. "The mask didn't fool them a bit. They all knew who I was, and they all asked me to come back." "I guess they all like you," his mama said. Tomas looked at her. Suddenly he felt wonderful, maravilloso. "Oh, I like them too," he said. And when he took off his mask, he was smiling. And here is a story about that story called A Tiger Called Tomas and a Writer Called Charlotte. She is the second tiger in this story. And I wrote this. This book came out after her death when I had taken on being her literary executor. And you'll hear about how that came to be here. Charlotte had once been a shy, lonely little girl. A little girl who, because her family moved from Norfolk, Virginia, to Detroit, Michigan, to Brookline, Massachusetts, and finally to New York City, who was the new girl over and over in school and in her neighborhood. A little girl who, because she wore thick glasses and a large corrective back brace for almost 2 years, looked different and, she thought, looked ugly. A little girl who preferred quietly watching and listening to speaking, who preferred engaging with the world through reading and writing to direct conversation. They might not like me, Tomas thinks of his new neighbors. In his feelings, in his self-doubt so strong it is almost certainty, Tomas is the shy, quiet little girl, Charlotte. My mother wrote many picture books. A Tiger Called Thomas was first published in 1963, then re-illustrated and republished in 1988 and 2003. As her books were issued and reissued over time, many of those illustrators changed the skin color of the main characters from white to black, with Charlotte's hearty approval. The same evolution occurred with the third reissue of A Tiger Called Thomas in 2003, and the ever unstated reason for Thomas's shyness and misgivings got another dimension when illustrator Diana Kane Blumenthal made Thomas black. And now, in 2018, we come to Thomas's fourth incarnation, Tomas. Latino children are often bilingual, so I thought making Tomas Latinx would add another layer to his universal story, showing that his isolation felt as much about language as it was about being the new kid on the block and skin color. I feel Charlotte would have approved of Tomas, that lonely little boy taking courage from disguising his real self behind a tiger mask. Charlotte, once a lonely little girl, found solace in her quiet manner and her retreat into writing. Yet just as his neighbors see through the mask to discover the real Tomas, Charlotte's very act of authorial hiding shows us to her clearly. In the end, and just like Tomas, she stands revealed, and we discover how loved she, Charlotte Shapiro Zolotow, my late mother, really was.
And is.
Thank you so much.
John Rankine is an award-winning multimedia artist who has made Eureka Springs home for the past 30 years. He was a co-founder of the Lovely County Citizen, a newspaper established in December 1999, where he wrote a weekly column about the art scene in Eureka Springs. He was also a regular columnist for the Eureka Springs Independent. John was awarded an Arkansas Individual Fellowship Award in 2011 for outstanding achievements in the arts for his photo installation, A Community at Peace. And he was a recipient of an Artist 360 grant for his Men with Earrings photo series in 2018. He curates rotating art exhibitions here at Brews every 6 weeks, just like the one that's hanging today. And John is co-owner of Brews, the place where we are now fortunate to be gathering tonight. So here is my dear friend, John Rankine.
It's my don't dream it, be it moment. The year was 1975. I was 20 years old and was the first in line to see the movie version of Rocky Horror Show in Toronto at our downtown theater. My roommate, Maria, and I, two aspiring and wannabe thespians, had the original London stage soundtrack to the show, knew every song by heart, and was excited the movie included many members of the original cast, including Tim Curry as Dr. Frankenfurter.
Oh my goodness.
What surprised Maria and I most while waiting in line for tickets was that we were the only ones in line. We loved the film and sat through it 3 times to a mostly empty theater. The movie received mediocre reviews and was a big commercial flop. Fast forward 3 years later. I was a struggling actor and had a couple of steady gigs as a singing and dancing waiter. Flashback Follies was a musical review that showcased music from the 1920s and the 1940s. Led by A. Frank Rufo, a Canadian veteran song and dance man, the show catered to a mostly blue rinse crowd, where a cast of gifted upstarts got to showcase their talents on stage in between serving them dinner. We were all young, made good money and tips, and gained a lot of stage experience. I can still remember the headline in the local newspaper: open call for new production of Rocky Horror. All they wanted for the audition was to perform a song of your choice. With my headshot, sheet music, and padded resume in tow, I headed downtown in a Toronto ice storm to audition. It was a cattle call, an open audition where every actor in the city was trying out for a part. After waiting more than an hour, I was ushered in. Standing next to the piano and facing 5 smiling faces, I sang A Lot of Livin' to Do from Bye Bye Birdie. Thank you. We will be in touch. The singing audition went well, but I knew my chances were slim of getting any role in the musical. But the next day, I got a call. They liked my audition. They had cast all the roles except for one. I had a call back for Rocky. For those of you unfamiliar with the musical, Rocky is the hunky monster with the Charles Atlas body, created by Dr. Frankenfurter for his own earthly pleasures. I was a far cry from Charles Atlas. Weighing in at 135 pounds soaking wet, but put on 3 layers of clothing to bulk myself up, and with nothing to lose, sang Rocky's solo, The Sword of Damocles. Knowing I had no chance in hell of getting the part, I was totally relaxed and nailed Rocky's song, surprising even myself at how well it went. Thank you, said the smiling faces. We will be in touch. The following day I got a call. They liked my audition. They had made some casting changes and wanted me to play the role of Brad Majors, the in-the-closet nerd engaged to Janet Weiss, who gets seduced by Dr. Frankenfurter after seeking refuge in the mad scientist's castle to get out of the rain. I couldn't believe it. I was in my first professional show. A week later, we met with the show's producer, director, musical director, costume designer, our 5-piece band, and most importantly, the rest of the cast, a super talented bunch of actors who forced me to up my acting and singing game. This was all 45 years ago, and much of this pivotal time in my life is more than a little blurred, but some events still stand out. Shopping for shoes. It might be easier now, but trying to find women's stiletto heels that fit a man's size 11 foot became a challenge. The high heels were for the group finale number, and we had to find shoes that not only fit, but were sturdy enough to dance in. The entire cast took over a Canadian version of a Payless shoe store, and fortunately, the staff had as much fun finding and trying on shoes for us as we did, while prancing and dancing in the aisles while other customers looked on. Alas, poor Ted, who was playing Frankenfurter, had some very, very big shoes to fill. Not only did he have to recreate Tim Curry's iconic role, Ted also had size 13 feet and had to have his 6-inch platform shoes custom made. The success of Rocky Horror rests on the performance of Dr. Frankenfurter, the sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania. Ted Pearson was a recent a little more, sorry. Ted Pearson was a recent theater school graduate and was playing the lead in the musical Man of La Mancha while rehearsing for Rocky Horror. Often Ted arrived at rehearsal still in his Don Quixote makeup, with a booming baritone voice and a towering 6'8" in heels and a lithe, sexy frame. Ted took command of the stage. We had 3 weeks of rehearsal, with the first 2 weeks not going well. Our director was fired, a new one was hired, and with 1 week to go, we opened up the 1,200-seat Rex Danforth Theater to a sellout crowd. The Rocky Horror Picture Show had become one of the biggest cult films of all time that still plays today in late-night movie houses. Many movie patrons dressed as their favorite character could recite almost all the film's dialogue and came prepared with an assortment of props, many of which were flung onto the movie screen during special moments. Our opening night audience, while a little raucous, were tame and more reserved compared to the movie audience. I put up with shouts of asshole every time I walked out on stage, and did have to dodge a well-aimed piece of flying toast. To say I had opening night jitters was an understatement. On stage and stripped down to my tighty-whities, I didn't have to feign being the nervous nerd facing a castle full of weirdos. It's not uncommon for musical numbers to be cut when going from stage to screen, and Rocky Horror was no different. Cut out of the movie is Brad's solo, a slow ballad lamenting his betrayal of his fiancée Janet Weiss. Brad finally gives in to the mad scientist's sexual advances, and his guilt pours out in song. Alone, on stage, high above on scaffolding with a single spotlight, I had to sing the ballad that 98% of the audience had never heard before. Maybe it was shock, pity, or something else, but there was a total hush from the audience, followed by applause at the end of the song. I had never been so relieved. The reviews came in and were mostly great, especially to the cast. The Toronto Star critic Gina Mallett, given the nickname Gina Malicious by actors for her vicious theater critiques, gave the show a semi-thumbs up. It didn't end there. After the week's run, we went into the recording studio and recorded The Time Warp and Over at the Frankenstein Place, the duet between Brad and Janet. The record was to promote the scaled-down cabaret version of the show that toured mostly in bars. The tour, although short-lived, was an adventure filled with so many stories, but we'll have to share the tale of performing in a biker bar in rural Ontario another time.
Oh my gosh.
My life imitates art moment came while on tour. Like Brad and Frankenfurter's moments in the musical, Ted and I started our love affair. Secretly at first, while sharing a hotel room together. Ted was a lovely man, whose presence was as big offstage as on. We continued seeing each other after the tour, but due to my own insecurities, I ended the relationship. It was not Ted's fault, but everywhere we went, I almost felt invisible. Ted's persona was so larger than life. I needed to figure out how to shine on my own. I stuck with theater a few more years, playing Jesus in Godspell and Linus in You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. I did a serious play I was proud of by a new Canadian playwright, but nothing ever came close to the thrill, excitement, and pure joy of Rocky Horror. Seeing the writing on the wall, I gave up acting, a decision made easier by not getting much work. It spawned my move to Key West, Florida, where I started a new chapter in my life, a fresh start to reinvent who I thought I needed to be. I'm now Facebook friends with a couple of fellow castmates, but lost touch with everyone from the show after my move to Key West. I later found out our producer died of a heroin overdose. Chris, who played Riff Raff, committed suicide. Tiny Margot, who played a killer saxophone, died from alcohol abuse. And most sad was the loss of sweet, sweet Ted, who battled HIV for many years to AIDS. There were so many life lessons my 23-year-old self learned in that brief moment in time, and it will always remain my don't dream it, be it moment. Thank you.
That was so good. Let's hear it again for John. We all know that everyone who lives will someday die, and that everyone who loves stands a good chance of outliving at least some of those they love. What do we do in the face of such loss? We grieve. In this very different story, Crescent is going to read, she explores again in the context of Halloween, 50 Shades of Grief. Here's a trigger note. This story references suicide and violence. It also asks how we love anyway in the face of such things. Crescent, like Thomas in the first story, believes that love is larger than fear. She also thinks that grief and love are inseparable, and despite this, one can choose celebration. Crescent and her husband, Mark Graff, will be leading a small group fearless tour in Italy, like she mentioned earlier, this Christmas, and you're welcome to join them. But right now, I'd like to welcome back to the stage my friend Crescent.
Halloween is a lot of different things to different people. For one person in this room tonight, Marcia Choo-Choo Yearsley, it's her birthday.
And Lou.
Ah! Happy birthday to both of you. But for the rest of us, it's a socially sanctioned time to dress up as something or someone that we're not and eat a lot of sugar. But of course, if you have lost someone to suicide or violence, this time of year has a lot of triggers. And grieving people that you've lost, it's not static, it keeps changing, and it keeps changing us. Its color keeps changing, like the leaves in the fall, a time when grief itself, zombie-like, reemerges for many people. Grief has an infinite number of colors. Here are 50 of them. 1. I take a lot of deep breaths this time of year. 2. It's fall, the season inherently bittersweet and elegiac. All that plush color and harvest, all that stunning beauty, some years almost ostentatiously spectacular. All that run up to the long winter, white, brown, gray, the small seeming death of each year. Seeming, not actual. Quote, The fact of mortality makes loss certain, writes Adam Gornick. For all the ways science and medicine has reduced the suffering that a human life entails, the vector of sadness remains in place. The larger problem we face is not physical suffering, but sadness, and sadness is caused by the fact of loss. 4. Fall is also the season, my personal one. If you live long enough, you too may have one. An annual period of close-together cortege of losses and associations. David's birthday, Ned's and my anniversary, my mother's death date, my father's birthday, my birthday, Thanksgiving, Ned's death date. All between the end of September and the beginning of December. And what are you thankful for? People commonly ask at Thanksgiving. A good question, and apropos for the holiday. And yes, I am honestly grateful for much. Yet, this query does land in the middle of all of this. I've recited this loss list before. Excuse me if it's a repetition for you. 5. I remind myself that Halloween iconography, especially the hanging effigies, is not intended to trigger, not intentionally cruel. I remind myself that I cannot and should not expect the world to be sensitive to people who loved someone who hung him or herself. That would be like asking that the world be carpeted so that I could walk barefoot. 6. Even the word trigger is probably a trigger for those who lost someone they loved to a bullet, whether self or other inflicted. 7. I remind myself that other Halloween-related holidays, like Mexico's Dia de los Muertos, have an entirely different meaning. They're about getting cozy with death as part of life, about the border between the two worlds, that of the living and the dead, thinning so that spirits can pass over and through to say hello to those still quick. A sugar skull or bone-shaped cookie, a retablo inhabited by skeletons at work or play, feasting or marrying, the decoration of graves, cemeteries made party-like with families and friends visiting, playing music, eating, the food left on altars beside pictures of deceased loved ones. These celebrations are not macabre, but integrative. 8. A few months after David's death, I hand-washed a camisole, put it on a hanger, placed the hanger in a sunny bedroom window, forgot it was there, started violently when I walked in and saw it, stirred by the breeze hanging there. 9. In reference to the day someone leaves this world, there's a Sanskrit word I much prefer to death date. It's Maha Samadhi, meaning great or final liberation. I'm not sure that I believe that death is a great liberation, or at least that it is true of all deaths. Still, I like the idea and find a modicum of comfort in it. It is at least possible that David, in taking that action, was liberated from a psychic pain so unbearable that in fact he chose not to bear it anymore. 10. Unthinkably, in condolence notes and emails and conversations after David's death, several people said or wrote to me this: hang in there, or hang tough. 11. There are often days, weeks, months when grief vanishes. Not the loss, but the grief, the uncontrollable fits and tsunamis. I'm almost 23 years into my first widowhood, almost 10 into my second. This is the true hope that daily grief does end, which I can legitimately extend to anyone who is younger in widowhood than I am. In these phases, I am ungriefy, easy in my life. In these phases, it seems incomprehensible that I will again be visited by grief. The particularly brilliant blue of the fall skies no longer mocks. The trees, red, fuchsia, magenta, golden, ochre, orange, yellow, do not seem like sleight of hand, a trick for forgetting that winter is coming. Instead, both are mere neutral beauty. Taking them in fills me with wonder. What I mean to say is, I'm often happy now, and when I am not, it is mostly ordinary unhappiness, not grief. But, as I've experienced it, and which I must tell you if the other is to have legitimacy, the uncontrollable fits and tsunamis do still come from time to time, and as far as I can tell, always will, though the intervals grow longer and longer. That's why we get through grief, but not over it. We get better, and life gets easier, but we do not heal. 12. 9 Octobers ago, I was driving my boyfriend of recent years, the gentleman I sometimes referred to then as my alpha dude, to the train station in Vermont where I then lived, so he could travel back to New York, where he then lived. Suddenly he said, leaning out the window, to scold a maple of particularly spectacular scarlet, "Oh, come on now, that's just showing off." This still makes me laugh. Alpha Dude is no longer my boyfriend, however. His name is Mark Graff. We married in December 2019. I no longer live in Vermont. We live together in a house we both love in an historic district in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Unpredictable, this life. 13. The geese. The effing geese honking as they head south. David had just gotten hearing aids, which he called listeners. We were outside in the garden. This would have been 2009-ish. His depression, the one he alluded to, saying he was in recovery from when we first met, had not yet returned. He was newly in love with the world, which had renewed its invitation to him once I met him, when he got on medication that worked, and was now doing so again with his listeners through sound. Crickets amazed him. The frogs croaking in the pond in the spring. He started the first time he heard the geese flying noisily overhead. "What's that?" he asked me, looking around for the source of the sound. "Geese," I said, pointing upward. He followed my finger, gazed up at them, and with a shrug said, "Honk if you love Vermont." This also still makes me laugh. Then, often it makes me cry, or feel that prickling, tightening in my throat. 16, every time. 17, and there are a lot of geese flying south this time of year. 18, before his depression returned, he was a funny guy. Affectionate in his way, devoted as I was to him. He was well known as a documentary filmmaker, but that was far from his only gift. That kitty pumpkin David carved one year, the last year before depression finally permanently took him down, that pumpkin kitty which we set on the porch of my mother's house, which was the talk of Elm Place, that pumpkin was a work of art. Both of them, my mother, Charlotte, and David, my partner of 10 years, were alive then. Neither of them are now. Both of them leaving life in her house, the house I grew up in. 20. Charlotte in her own bed, left easily as a leaf falling from a tree. She was 98, one of the last leaves still clinging stubbornly to the sturdy oak of her generation, a brown leaf still affixed right through winter. Then one day, she let go. 21. 3 months later, David left life there too. Hung himself in her basement. 22. After I found his body there, I never spent another night in that house. 23. Who was it who said to me recently, "I'm still pissed at him for doing it there"? I said, but he knew that house was going to be sold better there than the house in Vermont. Whoever it was, I can't remember, said, "Yes, but he knew you would be the one to find him, didn't he?" I no longer live in the house in Vermont either, where I did live with David. When I cleared out his office and found a collection of suicide letters he had written in 2011, though he did not actually take his life to 2014. All that pain borne for so long. 24. Every death leaves the survivors with unanswerable questions. But a death like Charlotte's, natural at 98, leaves so many fewer questions than David's, suicide at 74, or Ned's, bicycle accident at 44. 25. Ferncliff, crematorium near my mother's house. There, on November 25th, 2013, my 61st birthday, I escorted her box, which was made of cardboard and set on a wheeled table, through the open hinged door into the built-in concrete oven. My hand was the last to touch that box, and by extension, her body in it. Then, a kind Latinx man who worked for Ferncliff, a quiet man of gentle expression, gestured towards a switch, like a large light switch, to the right of the door to the oven. When I had escorted Ned similarly back in Arkansas 13 years earlier, there was no such switch. I understood I was to flip the switch. I understood that this would initiate the flames. I touched the switch, depressing it. 3 months later, walking David's box at Ferncliff toward the oven, thinking, David, did you know I was going to be doing this for you when we were here for Charlotte? The kind Latinx man had retired by then. I missed his calm presence. How compassionate he was without saying a word. 26. After Ned's death, Charlotte said to me, and I still think of it often, 23 years later, because you and Ned loved each other so much, a part of you died when he died. But because you and Ned loved each other so much, a part of Ned is alive as long as you are. 27. I used to hold the belief everything happens for a reason. What a comforting belief I found it for years. It was just like being rocked in a cradle. If it happened, it had a reason. And if it had a reason, that belief meant I needed to A, live with it, accept it, approve it, even if I couldn't understand it, and B, figure out that reason so I could learn what plan or lesson the divine had custom crafted especially for me. And I apologize to any of you who still hold this belief and enjoy that untroubled or less troubled contentment. Contentment I once enjoyed too, and I respect why you too would want to hold it. And I know that what I'm about to say sounds harsh, but I've promised as much honesty as I have about widowhood, and losing this belief was an enormous part of widowhood for me. This secondary loss was difficult, excruciating, fundamental. It shifted my foundation, as it has for a number of other widows I've walked with. Now, everything happens for a reason looks to me like infant theology. It is not tenable for eyes open adults. In fact, it now seems to me almost obscene in its unintentional cruelty and narcissistic human arrogance. 28. Because things happen, period. Whether or not they do so for a reason meaning someone or something intended them to, so that the occurrences of this world, however awful, are intentional, meaningful, carrying a personal message for us, is unknowable. Because while wanting to believe that there are such reasons for the cruel happenings inherent in existence, and believing we can therefore know that reason, is natural, the answer to a basic human question which arises out of understandable inquiry, that question does not have a definitive human answer. Any supposition about what God's or one's higher power's reason for something happening, assuming that there is a God or higher power, or that you believe there is speculation. Some would say it's faith-based, and others would say a delusional fairy tale we tell ourselves because randomness is too awful to contemplate. 29. It was Ned's death that, for me, burnt that belief to ash. 30. And I mourned losing everything happens for a reason. I had loved that belief. It was so comforting. I loved the feeling of certainty it gave me, a certainty I now recognize as illusion, wishful thinking, magical thinking, a mistaken form of control. Though I could no longer hold everything happens for a reason with integrity, I missed it. 31. Out of its loss, I gradually found and built a new foundation, less elegant, less simplified, but with the large advantage of being undeniably objectively true and in the locus of my control. Holding this new foundation also means I no longer have to contort myself, uncomfortably creating a fiction to explain why the incomprehensible, horrific, and tragic has taken place. 32. How can I make use of what has happened? That is my present foundation, and has been since 2000, the year of Ned's death. It is a question a human being can both ask and answer. I cherish this question. I ask it of myself often. 33. And speaking of theology, why the F don't people who are attempting to console others who have suffered grievous, non-negotiable, disorienting, devastating loss keep their effing theology to themselves? Never, ever offer verbal or written condolences that assume a shared spiritual viewpoint unless you are positive that there is one. And there's almost no way to be positive about this, even if you've gone to the same church or meditated together. Medicated too, I suppose, for decades. 34. Someone actually said this to me after Ned died. I guess God must have needed him more than you did. 35. Like, if I had been more whiny, insecure, needy, clutchy, God would have said, okay, Ned can stay on earth a while longer. I won't kill him yet. 36. Even if this were so, who would want such a God? Who could find comfort in such a theology? 37. But my own non-deistic theology does say this: choose love. In whatever way you can. Friendship love, dating again love, passionate sexual love, loving a pet, loving nature, grandchildren, earth, which desperately needs activist lovers at this moment, loving, even getting into bed, even solo between clean, line-dried sheets, loving the way sunlight slants through the window and falls on a bowl of Honeycrisp apples. 38. Despair will sometimes make choosing love seem impossible, maybe for a long time. Grief drains so much, including the capacity to imagine that one's life might ever be better. Because after all, since she or he cannot return to life, how could it be better? Grief is an eclipse in totality, a shadow so dense all light is blotted out. Easy to believe that the sun, obscured, might no longer be there, that all light has ended permanently. But the blocking factor moves, and it turns out the sun was there all along, not just for other people, but for us who grieve. Is that theology? The eclipse part isn't. It's science, true whether you believe it or not. But light is metaphor, light is love. Okay, that's theology-ish, and I believe it. Having said, keep your theology to yourself. I hope this does not offend. 39. Quote, to love less in order to lose less seems like no solution at all, continues Adam Gopnik. Quote, but to see loss squarely as an inherent condition of life sounds like wisdom. 40. Lots of different stuff from lots of different places which we drink and think and do can help us manage loss, more Gopnik. 41. Grief is individual, after all. 42. Because grief is one face of love. Because every marriage or relationship is different, and so is the widowhood which follows it, as well as the particular circumstances of the death. So amen to the different stuff Gopnik references. Whatever works, whatever helps you through grief, especially early stage grief, for however long that is for you, as long as you can hold it with integrity, well, by all means, do it or think it or take it. 43. What would I call early stage grief? I resided in that awful state for 5 or 6 years after Ned's death, long after I appeared functional to others. After David's death, maybe 5 months. I hate admitting that. I squirm inside saying it. 44. And this is not because I had been through it once. Of course there was some commonality, but those two experiences of widowhood and grief were far more different than they were alike. Different both circumstantially and in my emotional response, in what I felt was required of me and where and how I felt helpless. 45. Maybe it was because Ned was deep in life and wanted so much to remain in it. One of the ER nurses who was working the night he was medevaced in said something to a friend of a friend, and it got back to me. Quote, "All of us who worked that night were just wrecked by it. That man fought so hard. His heart stopped and restarted 3 times. Sometimes this comforts me. Sometimes it wrecks me too." 46. And David didn't want to be here, or his disease didn't want him to, or made it impossible for to stay. And I come back to this too, over and over, as most suicide widows I think do. Did David take his own life, or did depression take it, the final theft after robbing him a little at a time for years? 47. Or maybe I just didn't love David as much, or as well, or as deeply, or as something as I did Ned. I hate that too. It seems one more heartless, disrespectful cruelty to David, as if how heartless, cruel, and disrespectful he was to himself were not bad enough. And it makes me ask unanswerable, pointless questions. Pointless because whatever the degree of inadequacy with which I loved him, I did love him. Pointless because it always comes out the same way, which cannot be undone. He's dead. He killed himself. 48. Gopnik continues. Sometimes it helps to dwell on the immensity of the universe. Sometimes it helps to feel the presence of ongoing family and community. Sometimes it helps to light a candle and say a prayer. 49. And sometimes, quote, it helps to sit and breathe. 50. I take a lot of deep breaths this time of year.
Let's hear it again for Crescent. That was fabulous. And I have heard some great stories tonight, and they are tough acts to follow. But I'm going to try. I'm going to read one more very short story. It's an encore performance. Forgive me if you've heard this again. I like to read it during the Halloween season. One Halloween long ago, my younger sister, one of my friends, and I went trick-or-treating. Our friend Stevie was the middle son of our new-to-town Methodist preacher. He and his family lived across the alley from our house in the parsonage next door to the church. I was 8 years old on that Halloween, the oldest in the group, and therefore I felt responsible for the safety of the others. After 2 hours of trick-or-treating, we each had a large grocery sack full of candy. On our way home, we were confronted by the preacher's oldest son, Buddy, who was 12 years old and a bully. He stole all our candy. We immediately ran home crying all the way to tell my mother. She was furious, and she went in search of Buddy with the 3 of us hot on her heels. She found him, retrieved our candy, and cussed Buddy out. I didn't know she knew such words. Some that I'd never heard. She held on to Buddy's arm, and we all proceeded to walk the couple blocks to the parsonage. When my mother rang the doorbell, she was still furious, and she continued to use the offensive words in front of the preacher. He was so mad at Buddy that he didn't seem to notice my mother's salty language. Perhaps he knew better than to mess with the mad mother bear. The next Sunday, my mother put on a nice dress, her gloves, and her favorite hat. She held her head high and crossed the alley to the Methodist church, where she sat in her usual seat on the pew in the last row. The preacher never mentioned the incident, but he never bothered us again, and I learned several new words that Halloween night. The one I remember the most was in a sentence my mother yelled at the bully when she said, "Give up that candy, you little son of a bitch." Thank you again. You've been a wonderful audience, and a big thank you to the guest storytellers, Crescent Dragonwagon and John Rankine. It was a privilege sharing the stage with them. And thanks again to Brews for letting us share this lovely space. Our next show, let's hear from Brews. Our next show will be December 6th. Thanks again, everyone.
You've been listening to Homegrown Tales, a live storytelling event held at Brews, 2 Pinted Spring in Eureka Springs. Join us again next time for more Homegrown Tales.